Imagine this. Clint Eastwood, the legendary Hollywood star, returns to his small, struggling hometown after decades away. But this isn't the reunion you're expecting. As old wounds reopen and a bitter rivalry resurfaces, Clint's return is met with both hope and skepticism. He's not here to make a movie, though. He's here to rebuild a town on the brink of collapse. What happens next will leave you questioning the power of second chances and what it really means to come home. Can Clint Eastwood save Greenfield, or will his efforts be crushed under the weight of history? Stick around, because what he does for the town will shock you. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Now, get ready for a tale you won't want to miss. It had been decades since Clint Eastwood left his small hometown of Greenfield. Back then, he was just another teenager with big dreams, the kind that were too big for a town like Greenfield. The dusty streets and small-town rhythm couldn't contain him. He set his sights higher, heading west to Hollywood, where the glitz and glamour of fame were waiting. Now Clint was no longer that kid. He was a legend, an actor, a director, a symbol of Hollywood itself. His name was synonymous with toughness and resilience, with roles that defined a generation. And yet, here he was, about to step foot on the same streets he'd once escaped from. His return to Greenfield was bound to stir something, but what exactly? The news spread like wildfire, buzzing through the town like a summer storm. It wasn't just the usual chatter of a celebrity passing through. This was Clint Eastwood, the Clint Eastwood, coming home. Some residents were thrilled, nostalgic for the days when Clint was just another kid kicking cans down the same streets they once walked together. Others, however, couldn't shake the feeling that his return wasn't as simple as it seemed. Why now? Was he here for a quick nostalgia trip? Or was there something more at play? Clint rolled into Greenfield one afternoon in his vintage convertible, the engine humming softly as he cruised through the town's main street. It was almost as if he was trying to go unnoticed, the way a local would, slipping back into the town without the usual fanfare. No flashing cameras, no entourage, just Clint, a man who had conquered Hollywood, quietly returning to the place where it all began. But as the sleek car rolled past the local diner, the whispers started. He's here to make a movie about his life. You'll see, big Hollywood film crew coming soon. Someone at the gas station speculated, nudging their friend as Clint's car disappeared around the corner. Or maybe he's just scouting Greenfield for some other project. You know, Clint's always had a soft spot for the little guy, said another voice, one of the shopkeepers who had barely seen Clint since he left. The town was a mix of curiosity and doubt. Was Clint here to relive his glory days? Or was this just a quick stop before he disappeared back into the world that had made him famous? While the townspeople speculated, Clint kept to himself. He wasn't there for the gossip. He had scheduled private meetings with a few of the town's leaders, keeping his intentions under wraps, fueling even more speculation. No one had a clear answer. Not yet. But that didn't stop the questions from swirling. The town's leaders, too, were divided over Clint's return. The mayor, a young upstart with aspirations of transforming Greenfield into something more modern, saw Clint's presence as an opportunity, a way to bring attention and perhaps investment to the town. Clint Eastwood in Greenfield? That's huge. This town could be something if we play it right, he said, his voice brimming with optimism. But the older council members weren't so sure. They remembered Clint as a kid who left Greenfield for bigger things, abandoning the town's struggles. Would he return to help, or would he just use the town as a stepping stone for his next project? The real concern, however, came from George, the owner of the local diner and Clint's childhood rival. George had never forgiven Clint for leaving. He had watched as Clint's fame skyrocketed, while Greenfield stayed stuck in the same slow-moving rut. George wasn't interested in welcoming Clint back with open arms. In fact, he resented him. Clint Eastwood's just here to stroke his ego, he muttered under his breath as he wiped down the counter, barely making eye contact with the handful of regulars sipping coffee at the bar. He's never cared about Greenfield. Always thought he was too good for us. To George, Clint was just another Hollywood star, looking for a quick hit of nostalgia, maybe even a documentary on his life. But George didn't believe it for a second. He saw Clint's return as nothing more than a convenient PR stunt, a way for Clint to reconnect with his roots without really doing anything meaningful. The tension in Greenfield was palpable. On the surface, it was just a hometown hero coming back to his roots, but beneath that was something much deeper. Old wounds were about to be reopened. As Clint's vintage car sat parked on Main Street, a wave of nostalgia swept through him. It had been years since he'd driven through these roads. Greenfield had changed in some ways. More cracked sidewalks, a few businesses closed down, and the once vibrant town square now looked worn and forgotten. But in other ways, it hadn't changed at all. The same diner sat at the corner, the same red-brick school building stood tall in the distance, and most importantly, the same people remained, carrying with them memories of a boy who had left, chasing something bigger than this small town could offer. Clint decided to reconnect with some of the old faces he remembered. The sheriff, Tom, was the first stop. He had been Clint's friend since childhood, partnering up to raise hell in the town back when they were teenagers, riding bikes down dirt roads, and talking about what they'd do if they ever got out of this place. Tom had grown into the role of sheriff with the same quiet determination he'd always had. He wasn't flashy, but he was dependable. The reunion was cordial. A few jokes about the old days were exchanged, and Clint asked about the town. "How's Greenfield holding up, Tom? Still hanging in there?" Clint asked, leaning back in the sheriff's office chair. "Yeah, we're doing okay. But let's be real, Clint. The town's struggling," Tom replied, his voice softer now, tinged with the weight of years spent trying to preserve a fading dream. "We're barely holding on. We lost a lot of good people, young families, businesses. It's not what it used to be." Clint nodded, glancing around the sheriff's office, at the faded photos of the town's history on the walls. "I see that, but maybe that's why I'm back. Maybe it's time to try something different." Tom looked skeptical, but didn't argue. Instead, he just sighed. "Well, the town's been waiting for a miracle, Clint. Not sure if you're the one to deliver it. But who knows? Maybe you'll surprise us." The conversation, though amicable, left Clint with a sense of unease. Tom had been a friend, but even he seemed resigned to Greenfield's decline. Maybe it was too late. Maybe Clint's return was just an echo of what could have been. The real tension, though, awaited him at the diner. George, Clint's childhood rival, had always been the one to keep score. The guy who never forgot a slight and who wore his grudges like a badge of honor. When Clint stepped inside the diner, the bell above the door chimed, and George's eyes flicked up from the coffee pot. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence hung heavy in the air, thick with the weight of years lost between them. Finally, George set the coffee pot down with a clink and gave Clint a tight smile. "Well, look who's come back to the OL stomping grounds. Mr. Hollywood himself." Clint, feeling the sharpness in George's tone, smiled back, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good to see you, George. How's business?" George let out a dry chuckle, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Better now that you're here to bless us with your presence. I'm sure the whole town's gonna throw a parade for you any minute now. Maybe you'll even buy us all a new jukebox to remember you by." Clint stiffened. The hostility in George's voice wasn't surprising, but it still stung. "I didn't come back to make a spectacle out of it, George. I came back because Greenfield needs help. Maybe more than ever." "Help?" George barked a laugh. "You think you're gonna fix everything with your fame and money? That's rich. You think you can just waltz back into town and pretend like you never left? We don't need a hero, Clint. We need someone who's been here, someone who didn't just run off the second things got tough." Clint's expression darkened. "I didn't leave because I couldn't hack it, George. I left because I had dreams. Dreams that were too big for Greenfield. You should try dreaming for once, instead of sitting here on your high horse." The words hung in the air for a moment, thick and bitter. George's jaw tightened and his eyes narrowed. "Yeah, well, maybe I'm tired of dreaming, Clint. Maybe I've spent too many years watching this town fall apart because guys like you took off, leaving us to pick up the pieces." The confrontation was escalating, and Clint could feel the old wounds reopening. This wasn't just about the town. It was personal. For George, Clint's success was a painful reminder of his own failure to break free from Greenfield's chains. But for Clint, George's bitterness was a reminder of everything he'd left behind. "You don't know the whole story, George," Clint said quietly, his voice edged with frustration. "I didn't forget Greenfield. You just outgrew it," George interrupted, his voice sharp. "You couldn't wait to get out. You thought this place wasn't good enough for you, And now you think you can waltz back in here and save us all with a checkbook. Clint's patience was wearing thin, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. I'm not here to buy anyone's love, George. I'm here to make a difference. You don't have to believe me, but I'm going to try. George's face twisted into a sneer. Well, good luck with that, Clint. But don't expect any thanks from me. With that, Clint turned to leave the diner, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft clang. The atmosphere was tense, and the weight of George's words lingered in the air long after Clint was gone. Clint knew this wasn't going to be easy. The town hadn't forgotten him, but they hadn't forgiven him either. And the hardest part wasn't going to be fixing the town. It was going to be fixing the broken relationships that lay beneath the surface. Clint spent the next few days quietly observing the town. He walked the streets, visited the small businesses, and took in the once familiar sights that now seemed faded and worn. The locals eyed him warily, some whispering behind their hands, others giving him cautious nods as he passed. He had come back to a place that had once felt like home, but now it was a place that barely recognized him. The warmth he remembered had been replaced by a cold, skeptical distance. The tension in Greenfield was palpable, especially after his heated encounter with George at the diner. Clint knew he needed to address the town directly, before the rumors spiraled out of control. He had a plan, but it was one he wasn't sure anyone would accept. As much as he wanted to step into the role of hero, Clint knew that in order to make a real difference, he had to approach this differently. He couldn't just throw money at the town and expect things to change. He needed to show Greenfield that he cared, and that meant facing the people who were most resistant to his return. So Clint called for a public meeting. Word spread quickly that Clint Eastwood himself would be speaking to the town. Some saw it as a chance to voice their concerns, others as an opportunity to get a glimpse of the man they'd once admired. The town hall was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Everyone had their own idea of what Clint was going to say. Some expected him to announce a big Hollywood project. Others thought he might make a grand gesture, but no one was prepared for what Clint was about to reveal. The room fell silent as Clint stepped up to the microphone, his weathered face calm but serious. For a moment, he simply stood there, letting the room settle. This wasn't going to be an easy speech. There were too many old wounds, too many people who had been hurt by his absence, and too many who felt betrayed by his return. But Clint wasn't there to make excuses or placate anyone. He was there to speak the truth. Look, I know I haven't exactly been the best example of someone who stays committed to their roots, Clint began, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of his past. I left Greenfield years ago, chasing a dream that took me far away. And I didn't look back. For that, I'm sorry. But what I can tell you now is that I'm here because I believe in this town. And I believe that Greenfield can be something more than what it is right now. There was a murmur in the crowd. Some seemed moved by his honesty. Others remained skeptical, arms crossed, waiting for the catch. Clint continued, his words coming with more conviction. I've spent the last few years thinking about what I could do to give back. And I realized that what this town needs isn't more empty promises. It needs action, real change. And that's what I'm here to offer. A hush fell over the room. Clint paused, letting the silence hang in the air. Then, with a deep breath, he unveiled his plan. I'm not just here for a quick visit. I'm here to invest in Greenfield. I'm putting my money where my mouth is. I want to fund the revitalization of this town, bring businesses back, create jobs, and most importantly, give the kids here a reason to stay. A scholarship fund, job training programs, and yes, I'm working with the local leaders to help rebuild the places that are falling apart. The room was stunned. Some residents exchanged surprised looks. Others shifted in their seats, unsure whether they had heard him correctly. George, sitting in the back, let out a short, derisive laugh. This is rich, he muttered under his breath, loud enough for a few nearby to hear. Clint Eastwood, the big-time actor, thinks he can fix Greenfield with his Hollywood money. Clint's gaze shifted toward George, his eyes narrowing just slightly. You know, George, I've been thinking about what you said to me the other day, Clint said, his voice low but firm. Maybe you're right about one thing. I can't fix everything with money. But I can help create opportunities. And if that's not good enough for you, I don't know what is. The words hit harder than Clint intended, and for a moment, George stood frozen, the skepticism he wore like armor now seeming hollow. But then, a voice from the crowd spoke up, cutting through the tension. "I think we could use the help," an older woman said, standing up from the back of the room. Her voice was shaky, but there was a note of hope in it. "My family's been here for generations. I've seen Greenfield at its best, and I've seen it at its worst. I think we deserve a shot at something better. I don't know about everyone else, but if Clint Eastwood's offering a chance, I'm taking it." A ripple of agreement spread through the crowd. People looked at each other, uncertain but willing to listen. The mood in the room shifted, just slightly, but it was enough to make Clint feel like he wasn't wasting his time. But George wasn't done. He stood up, his hands gripping the back of his chair as he glared at Clint. "You think this is just about money and rebuilding buildings? This town needs more than that. It needs real heart, not some Hollywood fairy tale. You think you're going to come in here and fix all of this with your checkbook? Maybe you should have stayed gone." The room fell silent again. It was clear that George wasn't going to make it easy for Clint. The two men stared at each other, the old animosity still boiling just below the surface. But Clint wasn't about to back down. He had already made up his mind. He wasn't leaving without giving Greenfield a chance. Clint took a deep breath and addressed the room again. "I'm not trying to buy anyone's affection here. I know there are people in this town who don't trust me, who think I'm just another rich guy looking to make a quick buck. But I'm not asking for your love. I'm asking for your faith. Faith that we can build something better here. Together." There was a pause. The room seemed to hold its breath. After a few moments, the mayor stood up, his voice cutting through the tension. "I think we all have a lot of questions, but it's clear Clint's serious about this. And I think we should give him a chance. It's time to stop arguing about the past and look at the future." And just like that, the room seemed to exhale. The town had been divided, but there was now a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, Clint Eastwood was serious about helping Greenfield rebuild. After the tense meeting in the town hall, Clint wasted no time. He wasn't the type to sit around and wait for approval. With his plan laid out before the town, it was time for action. Clint knew that words alone wouldn't bring the change Greenfield so desperately needed. No, it was time to put his money and his reputation on the line. He began by meeting with the local business owners, making sure they knew he was serious about investing in their future. His approach was simple: provide capital for renovations, set up new job opportunities, and create programs to help young people stay in Greenfield instead of fleeing to the big cities. While many of the residents were still cautious, others were cautiously optimistic. They had heard promises before, but this time, Clint wasn't offering empty words. The first project Clint focused on was the town's abandoned factory. It had once been the heart of Greenfield's economy, employing hundreds of people. But when it closed down years ago, it left a gaping hole in the town. Clint reached out to developers, contractors, and job creators, arranging meetings to turn the space into a community center, an open, accessible place where people could work, learn, and find support. The renovation was massive, with construction crews buzzing around every day, hammering, sawing, and welding. The sounds that once represented a dying town now represented the birth of something new. As the project progressed, more and more residents came forward, offering help in any way they could. Some volunteered their time, others donated supplies. Clint's presence was slowly starting to chip away at the cynicism that had taken root in Greenfield. Still, not everyone was on board. George was the loudest critic, of course. The diner owner seemed to take offense at every new development, claiming Clint was making a mockery of the town's authenticity. "Hollywood doesn't know what it's like to live here. You think some new buildings and jobs are going to make up for years of people leaving?" George would scoff at anyone who mentioned Clint's projects. Clint tried to reach out, sitting down with George at the diner one afternoon, hoping to mend fences. "I know you don't like what I'm doing, George," Clint said, his voice calm but firm. "But I'm not doing this to steal anything from you. I'm doing this to help. I'm trying to give Greenfield a shot at something better." George crossed his arms and glared at Clint. "I don't need your charity, Clint. I've been here all these years, and I'm still standing. This town doesn't need some rich guy swooping in and pretending to fix things." Clint looked him dead in the eye. "You're right. This town doesn't need me to fix it, but it does need something to believe in. And if this town's going to survive, it can't be stuck in the past, George. We can't keep going the way we have. You don't have to like it, but I'm going to give it everything I've got." George didn't answer. He simply walked away, but Clint could see the cracks in his armor. Clint's words had struck a chord. Even if George wasn't ready to admit it, something in him had begun to shift. Outside of George's stubborn resistance, the town started to change. Clint's community center took shape. The old schoolhouse was converted into a modern library, offering after-school programs and evening classes. The local diner, the one George ran, was given a much-needed facelift. New paint, updated booths, and a fresh menu were just the start. George, begrudgingly, took a loan from Clint to help make it happen. He may have protested at first, but even he knew this was the town's last chance. Young people began to trickle back into town. The scholarships Clint set up were helping local high school graduates attend college, with the stipulation that they return to Greenfield after graduation to give back to the community. The program was starting to take hold. Local businesses, too, began to see the benefits, with new faces popping in, new money flowing, and the occasional tourist coming through town to visit the newly restored sites. Despite all the progress, Clint could feel the undercurrent of skepticism still present in Greenfield. Many of the older residents watched him closely, unsure if his efforts were just another fleeting trend. Others, though, started to talk. A new sense of optimism had taken root, though it was fragile. And Clint knew that if he was going to truly make a difference, he couldn't afford to give up. He couldn't let George, or anyone else, stop him from completing what he had started. The more Clint worked, the more the town began to change. The community center buzzed with life. Kids playing basketball, teens learning coding, adults taking business courses. People started showing up not because Clint was a celebrity, but because they believed in what he was trying to do. Clint wasn't just rebuilding the town's infrastructure, he was rebuilding its spirit. And then came the most important step, the opening of the new Greenfield Job Fair. Clint had worked with the local Chamber of Commerce to organize it, bringing in companies from nearby cities to offer employment opportunities to Greenfield residents. The fair was a roaring success, with hundreds of townspeople in attendance. For the first time in years, there was a genuine sense of hope that Greenfield might not only survive, but thrive. But just as things seemed to be going well, George made a last-ditch effort to sabotage Clint's work. He tried to rally the town's oldest, most conservative residents against the changes Clint had started, claiming that the new developments were erasing Greenfield's history. He even organized a protest, calling for the town to reject Clint's so-called corporate takeover. Clint, now more determined than ever, was ready to face the challenge head-on. He showed up at the protest, walking into the crowd with the same calm demeanor he had adopted throughout this entire process. George was there, leading the charge, but Clint wasn't backing down. He stood at the front of the protest, silently watching as the crowd chanted. When George caught sight of Clint, he approached with a sneer. "I knew you couldn't stay away, Clint," George said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you've won, but you haven't. This town will never be the same." Clint didn't flinch. "That's the point, George. Things need to change. And whether you like it or not, I'm not backing down. Not now. Not ever." For a moment, there was silence. The protesters looked between Clint and George, unsure of what to do. But then, slowly, people began to disperse. The protests lost their steam as the townspeople realized that Clint wasn't just another rich guy trying to make a name for himself. He was committed, and the changes were already happening. Greenfield was moving forward, with or without George's approval. Despite all the progress Clint had made in Greenfield, the undercurrent of resistance was far from gone. George's protests had faltered, but they hadn't disappeared. As the town began to grow, so did the tension between the town's old guard, represented by George, and the new energy Clint had brought with him. The diner, once a symbol of the town's history, now felt like a battleground where the past and the future collided. The opening of the Greenfield Community Center marked a turning point. It was a milestone in Clint's effort to revitalize the town, a place where old and new Greenfield could coexist. The day was filled with excitement and optimism. Local families gathered to see the changes, and the once crumbling space was now vibrant with life. Young people mingled, local businesses proudly set up booths, and Clint was there to celebrate with the townspeople. It should have been a moment of triumph. But George had one final move to make. As Clint stood on the stage, addressing the crowd and thanking everyone for their hard work, George appeared at the back of the room. He was alone, but his presence was undeniable. His face, once tight with skepticism, now twisted in anger. He stood in the doorway, his eyes locked on Clint, waiting for the moment to strike. Clint had seen George's attitude shift over the months, but this moment was different. The bitterness in George's expression was raw, untamed. Clint knew what was coming. He could feel it in the air. "I can't stand by and watch this town be sold out." George's voice boomed across the room, cutting through the cheers of the crowd. "Clint Eastwood's here, pretending to fix things, but what he's really doing is turning Greenfield into some sort of corporate playground. This isn't what Greenfield is about." The crowd fell silent, and all eyes turned toward George. Clint, though surprised, stood his ground. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to let George derail everything. The tension was palpable. This was the showdown Clint had been expecting, but not quite like this. Clint stepped forward to the microphone, his voice steady, yet firm. "You're right, George. I've been trying to make Greenfield something more than it is now. But I didn't come here to destroy the town's heart. I came to give it a chance. To give its people a chance." George's face reddened with rage. "You think you can fix everything with your money? With your big ideas? This town isn't some project for you to leave behind when you're bored. I've spent my whole life here, Clint. I watched as people left for bigger cities. I watched as this place fell apart, and I watched you run off, leaving us to pick up the pieces." Clint's voice softened, but the anger in his eyes was clear. "I know I wasn't here when the town needed me, George. I can't change the past, but I'm here now, and I'm not leaving until I see this town rise again. If you can't understand that, then that's on you." The room was frozen. No one moved. The air was thick with the conflict between the two men, a fight for Greenfield's soul. But George wasn't done. "You think you can just waltz in and rewrite history, Clint? You're not a hero. You're just a man looking for redemption. And I'm not going to let you destroy what this town really stands for." Clint, though his patience thinning, didn't back down. He knew this wasn't just about buildings or money. It was about the pride of a town that had been forgotten by many. He understood George's anger, but he also knew it was time to move forward. Greenfield couldn't stay frozen in the past. "Maybe I'm not a hero, George," Clint said, his voice calm but with a hard edge. "But I'm not asking you to make me one. I'm asking you to let this town have a future. A future that doesn't just rely on memories and grudges. Greenfield deserves better than that." George's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't say anything more. His words, laced with frustration and pain, had lost their power. The crowd, who had been tense up until that point, began to murmur. Some nodded in agreement with Clint. Others stood silently, reflecting on George's words, but there was a noticeable shift. Greenfield wasn't just divided by the past, it was divided by fear of change. Clint didn't leave the stage. He stayed there, letting the moment linger, letting the crowd absorb his words. Finally, the mayor stood up, his voice cutting through the silence. "I think it's time we look at what's ahead, not what's behind. Greenfield has a chance to grow, and I think we all know that." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, but George's silence spoke volumes. He turned away, walking out of the community center without another word. Clint watched him go, but he didn't feel a sense of victory. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about changing a town that had nearly given up on itself. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and Clint knew that. The hard part was yet to come. He would have to rebuild trust in Greenfield, piece by piece, person by person. As the night went on, Clint took a moment to step outside and look at the town. The lights from the community center illuminated the streets. There was still so much to do, so much work left to be done. But for the first time in years, Clint felt like Greenfield had a chance to thrive. The weeks following the showdown at the community center were quiet, but the changes in Greenfield were undeniable. Clint continued his work, making sure that the plans he had set into motion didn't just fizzle out. The community center became a bustling hub of activity. After-school programs, career workshops, and even fitness classes were held regularly. Young people, who once saw Greenfield as a dead-end town, now saw it as a place where they could build a future. The scholarships Clint had promised were helping local kids attend college, and the deal he struck with businesses to bring jobs back was slowly but surely paying off. The local diner, once the symbol of Greenfield's stagnation, now thrived. George, though still gruff and reluctant, couldn't deny that business was better. Clint's investment had breathed new life into the place, and George had grudgingly acknowledged that maybe he wasn't the only one who had a stake in Greenfield's future. The transformation wasn't immediate, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. As the town slowly but steadily grew, Clint remained a quiet presence, never seeking attention or praise. He spent his days working with local leaders, attending town meetings, and most importantly, listening to the people of Greenfield. They were his critics, his supporters, and his neighbors. Clint knew that real change didn't come from a single act of charity or from grand speeches. It came from sustained effort, patience, and a commitment to rebuilding what had been lost. But not everyone was on board. While many residents had embraced the changes Clint was pushing for, there were still those who longed for the simplicity of the past, who viewed his efforts as a betrayal of the town's history. The town, though transformed in many ways, remained divided. The rift between Clint and George still lingered, though it had grown quieter over time. George had stopped protesting as loudly, but his grudge against Clint remained. There was still that subtle tension whenever their paths crossed. One afternoon, Clint walked into the diner, where George was sitting behind the counter, cleaning a cup. It had been a while since Clint had seen him, and the silence between them had grown heavy. Clint pulled up a stool and sat down, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Got a minute, George?" Clint asked, his voice calm but firm. George didn't look up at first. He kept cleaning the cup, slowly, deliberately. Finally, after a long pause, he set it down and glanced up at Clint. "What do you want, Clint?" "I just wanted to check in. See how things are going," Clint said, his tone casual but with an underlying sincerity. "I know you've got your doubts, and I get it, but things are moving here. Greenfield's got a shot at something better, and I'd like you to be part of that." George snorted, shaking his head. "You're a lot more optimistic than I thought. All this," he gestured around the diner, then waved a hand dismissively. "It's just a bunch of band-aids on a broken town, Clint. Nothing more." Clint leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "Maybe, but it's a start, and a start is better than nothing. This town's been broken for a long time, George. But I'm not giving up on it. Not now." For a moment, George didn't say anything. He looked at Clint, his eyes narrowed, as if weighing the sincerity of his words. The tension was palpable, but then George let out a deep breath and shrugged. "Maybe you're right," George muttered, his voice softening just a little. "Maybe we all need a little help. But that doesn't mean I have to like it." Clint smiled, a small, understanding smile. "I'm not asking you to like it, George. I'm just asking you to stick around and see where it goes. We can't do this alone." And with that, the conversation ended. There was no grand reconciliation, no sudden burst of warmth. But something had shifted. The animosity between them, while still present, had eased. They were two men from the same town, fighting for the same thing, even if they didn't always agree on how to get there. As Clint left the diner that day, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The town had come a long way since his return. It wasn't perfect, and there was still much work to do, but Greenfield had been given a chance to rise from the ashes. Clint had done more than just revive the physical structures of the town. He had given it back its hope. For the first time in years, people were looking forward to the future instead of clinging to the past. In the months that followed, Clint continued his work behind the scenes, offering support and encouragement to the town's leaders and residents. He didn't need to be in the spotlight. He didn't need recognition. His reward came in the small victories, seeing a young person land their first job, watching families move back to Greenfield, and hearing laughter echoing from the community center. One evening, as Clint stood on the porch of his modest home, looking out over the town he had helped rebuild, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Greenfield was no longer the town it had been when he arrived. It was a town reborn, a place where people believed in the possibility of change, where hope had once again taken root. And for Clint, that was enough. He didn't need a statue in his honor or a parade in his name. He had done what he set out to do. He had given Greenfield a second chance. The road ahead would be long, and there would be challenges along the way. But for the first time in a long time, Clint knew that Greenfield had a future, one that was built not on the past, but on the promise of something new. And as Clint Eastwood looked out at the town he had saved, he knew that it had been worth every moment.